You're watching the Buck Stops here. I'm Barkha Dutt. On the program today, exactly 20 years ago on this very day, the Babri Masjid was demolished in Ayodhya. Many people believe that the Ayodhya movement is now a thing of the past. But is it really? How did that day change Indian politics forever? And can there ever be a resurgence of an Ayodhya-like movement? On the program tonight, that's our special debate.
16 लोग मारे गए थे, लेकिन आज तक कोई हत्या, लूट और आगजनी का कोई मुकदमा जो है इंस्टीट्यूट नहीं हुआ, न इंक्वायरी हो रही है.
Also coming up later on the Buck Stops here, William Dalrymple on his new book and why Afghanistan in 2012 is quite similar to Afghanistan in 1842. That's coming up on the other side of the Buck Stops here. Let's get started with our special focus on the Ayodhya movement tonight. Exactly 20 years ago on this very day, the 6th of December, the Babri Masjid, regarded as a disputed structure by many on the right of the political spectrum in India, was demolished, causing even leaders in the BJP to describe it as a sad event, as an event that should not have taken place. But the questions that still arise 20 years on is how this movement changed Indian politics. Did it change our polity forever? And in what ways? And also, could it ever take place again? Could there ever be a resurgence of such a frenzied and some would argue destructive movement? Before we bring you our debate tonight, for many individuals who've been lost in the haze of history, they're still awaiting for justice. Shikha Trivedi revisits Ayodhya.
These are the remains of a sawmill on the Faizabad Ayodhya road. Muhammad Sabir was the owner. When I met him the day before the Babri Masjid was demolished, he was convinced the secular culture of Awadh and the state would protect his family. The next evening he was hacked to death while running from the mob that burned down his sawmill. 20 years later, his son Shahid has not been able to restart his father's business because he has no papers to show the authorities it ever existed.
अब लाइसेंस सब जल फूक गया था जो है, इसमें मेरे पास कागज पत्र थे नहीं. जब हम गए वहाँ पे वन विभाग में तो उन्होंने बताया जो है कि लाइसेंस आपका है ही नहीं है, मशीन आपको नहीं चलाने देंगे, मशीन तब से बंद पड़ी है.
The riot affected families of Ayodhya received 2 lakhs each as compensation, but no justice.
16 लोग मारे गए थे, लेकिन आज तक कोई हत्या, लूट और आगजनी का कोई मुकदमा जो है इंस्टीट्यूट नहीं हुआ, न इंक्वायरी हो रही है.
After the defeat of the BJP in successive elections in UP, the Ram Janmabhoomi movement lost steam and calm returned to Ayodhya, but the Muslim community says they are paying a very steep price for keeping the peace.
जो स्थिति बनी हुई है ये है कि क्या कहते हैं, आप मस्जिद में अगर आप कुछ करना चाहें तो लोग वहाँ के प्रशासन, पुलिस प्रशासन खुद रोक देती है, साधु संत भी रोक देते हैं कि मुर्दा न दफन कीजिए, ये न दफन कीजिए, वो न दफन कीजिए.
ये क्यों करते हैं? ये
अपने मेजॉरिटी के ऊपर करते हैं कि मैं यहाँ मेरी तादाद ज़्यादा है, मैं मेजॉरिटी में हूँ, ये माइनॉरिटी में है.
If they remain quiet, it's because they continue to hope that perhaps one day the Ram Janmabhoomi Babri Masjid dispute will be resolved peacefully and the meaning of Ayodhya, a place without war, is restored somewhat. In Ayodhya, Shikha Trivedi for NDTV.
So on the Buck Stops here, looking now at the impact of December 6, 1992 on Indian politics and asking a more fundamental question. The circumstances that made the Ayodhya movement possible, could those circumstances recur in India, the way our politics has now evolved. Let's introduce our panel tonight. With me in the studio, Swapan Das Gupta, political analyst and senior journalist. Joining me tonight from Ahmedabad, Christophe Jaffalo, political scientist and author, a keen observer of Hindu nationalism and politics and caste and religious identity in India. Also joining me tonight, Yogendra Yadav, one of our best-known political analysts, now also a politician, a member of Arvind Kejriwal's Aam Aadmi Party. And also with me in the studio, Mazhar Hussain from Hyderabad, also the director of Confederation of Voluntary Associations, or COVA. Swapan, I'd like to start with you. In one of your columns on Ayodhya, you argued that this was a almost revolution. You know, it stopped just short. What would it have taken for it to be a complete revolution?
Oh, well, I think for a complete revolution, you would have needed an entire en bloc Hindu consolidation, not merely of society, but also of the political parties. Remember, after December 6th, it was the BJP and the RSS which were sort of seen to be at the front, organizing the movement.
The political patrons,
the political patrons of the movement, they actually applied the brakes. So it was very important. So it was almost, they felt that this was a movement which was really getting out of hand. That this was creating fissures far more than could have been controlled by anybody.
Did they lose control? That's
of course they lost control.
They lost control.
Of course it was quite evident. Anybody who was there in Ayodhya on December 6th could have vouched for the fact that this was a movement which had slipped out of the control of those who had promoted it. That it was the crowd, the mob, the Karsevaks, call it whatever you want to, who took matters into their own hands and decided that they are going to take the movement to another level altogether. And it was completely an unanticipated thing.
One of the other arguments that you've made, before I take this to Yogendra, is that it was less a frenzied or a galvanizing of emotion around the Ram Mandir, though it was in the Ram Mandir's name, but more a reaction to surrounding political circumstances. Khalistan you talk about the insurgency in Jammu and Kashmir, you talk about what was perceived by many to be the politics of appeasement by Rajiv Gandhi, the Shah Bano judgment. So you mean Mandir was incidental?
Yes, I think Mandir became the symbol of it. But actually there had been a simmering, what we might call a simmering majoritarian discontent, which is that after a long time, the Hindus felt, a large section of Hindus felt that they were being taken for granted. And they wanted to apply correctives to the system. And remember, this was also coincided with the profound crisis of the Indian economy. Socialism was running out of steam, the Berlin Wall had collapsed, Soviet Union had disintegrated. So all the cherished assumptions on which the old Nehruvian order had been based was slowly breaking apart. So I think Ayodhya movement, the Ram Temple movement, gave it that final push over the cliff.
Yogendra Yadav, that's a very interesting, if provocative, way to look at it, because a lot of people have traditionally seen Ayodhya as the signalling of the institutionalizing of Hindutva politics. What Swapan is arguing is that it has less to do with Hindutva per se, it has less to do with the Ram Mandir per se. It's actually a political reaction rather than a religious reaction, but one that in a sense galvanized itself around a Hindu sentiment, if one can call it that. Do you share that assessment? And more to the point, if he is indeed correct, then those circumstances could certainly come up again.
First, about the almost revolution, Burkha. I remember that day 20 years ago. I distinctly remember I had tears in my eyes. I don't think these were tears of joy, these were not tears of anticipated revolution. These were tears of someone who thought that this was the beginning of the end of the idea of India. I was wrong, I was happily wrong, but this was an almost coup against the very idea, against the very foundations on which this democratic republic was founded. And I would agree with one thing that Swapan said, that this was not a coup engineered by a few, that there was genuine mass support behind this movement, and what it demonstrated was that the language, the formal language of liberalism, the language of secularism, did not quite connect to the ordinary, the sentiments, the feelings, the the worldview of ordinary Indians, that there was a huge gap between the two. And that, to my mind, was actually the biggest, in a sense, the lesson of this. I compare Babri Masjid to emergency. Like emergency was a test by fire of the idea of democracy in India. Babri Masjid demolition was the test of the idea of secularism. Yes, we survived, and yes, we feel great about it, and in retrospect we can claim that this was, of course, the victory, inevitable victory of the idea of secularism. But a closer look at it would make us feel perhaps there was a lot of luck in that. Perhaps we've survived not unscathed. If you look at the condition of Muslim community today, that yes, justice has not quite been done, perhaps never will be done, and perhaps we survived less because of our civilizational strength, less because of our constitution, more because of contingencies of politics.
So Yogendra, you're actually arguing that it was a challenge to the very idea of India, it was a challenge to Indian secularism, and that idea of India survived, and you were apprehensive that it would actually come crashing down.
That's right. As I said, I honestly thought this was the end of the idea of the country. You know, I imagined there could be reactions, and I thought if something like what happened to Mrs. Gandhi were to happen to any of these big leaders who led the movement that day, which was not impossible at that point, and I could just see, you know, kind of civil war happening in the country. Thankfully, you know, people like me were completely mistaken. Yeah. And yes, we have survived. But do remember that we survived not because of what the seculars in this country believed, the reasons they would survive. We did not survive because, not necessarily because of the deep civilizational strength. It was, as I said, the contingencies of politics, things like caste, region, playing role which were unanticipated. And that provided, strangely and in a completely unanticipated way, a bulwark against a communal partition, against the idea that you could make communal cleavage the principal cleavage of Indian politics. That did not happen, and that's why the whole thing was halted.
I understand what you're saying, and I do want to go to Christoph, but just a quick comment from you, Swapan, because you have argued that actually what happened around 1992, leading up to that point, was a robust challenge to the assumptions of Nehruvian secularism. Yogendra is making exactly the opposite argument. He's saying he actually felt that the foundations of secularism were going to come down with the Babri Masjid. And I think there is some merit to the argument, A, that it was a challenge to secularism, and B, it's coalition politics. It's the emergence of regional leaders. It's the fact that there is no pan-Indian leader who can deliver a majority at the center that, in a sense, keeps the checks and balances of our system, not the idea that Nehru dreamed of itself.
Yeah, exactly, and I think that's quite true to a large extent, that if the idea was to form a Hindu voting bloc, that was offset by, you know, caste, by region, by political identities, etc. So there was no Hindu political bloc which emerged, a solid one, which would endure election after election, which could endure. Certainly that's true. But at the same time, let us recall that there were certain facets of the Ayodhya movement which were a challenge. You know, one of the two words which have endured from then still continues, albeit in a rather reckless way in the social media. One is the term minorityism, the other is the term pseudo-secularism. I think
isn't the second one a completely meaningless phrase?
You know, I think what basically, when they talk about pseudo-secularism, the meaning is very clear. That please do not make the term Hindu an illegitimate category.
Now,
that's a very small point, but it's a point which, in a particular context, perhaps had to be driven home.
But what is interesting, and let me take this to Christoph Jaffalo, is that the Hindu may be a legitimate identity, but it has never really, except for perhaps those years, emerged as you yourself have said, as a concrete political identity. Let me take this to you, Christoph, because one of the things that you have actually looked at is whether caste today is more of a determinant of identity than religion. And which plays to one of the reasons why there will never be such a thing as the Hindu vote. And by the way, there's actually no such thing as a Muslim vote either, as parties after parties discover. And you've also looked at how liberalization and the changing economy have now, in a sense, taken the edge off ethno-religious identities or aspirations. So from where you're placed, do you believe an Ayodhya could ever happen again in the way that India has now evolved?
Well, before turning to this question, I'd like to return to the first intervention that we have heard, and I would like first of all to really, well, I would say question the idea that this movement was spontaneous. You know, do remember these sequences? We had Yatra politics for 3 years before the 6th of December 1992. We had the Ramshila Pujas, we had the Yatratra, we had the Ashti Kalash Yatra, 1989, 1990, 1991, every year there was a movement. And what was behind that, if not a political movement, if not a political strategy? So where is the spontaneity in all this? Of course you want to mobilize people, and in the end, if they get out of control, they'll do what you want them to do.
Yeah.
But I don't buy the idea that that was a grassroots movement coming from below. That's no sociologist meaningful in its approach would support. On the question of secularism in India after 6th of December 1982, of course it has been damaged. No, it's not a closed chapter at all. It's a landmark. You know, we have just finished a book looking at the Muslims of 11 Indian cities. All of them refer to the 6th December, this date, as a turning point. This is an acceleration, at least, if not a starting point, in some ghettoization process. For instance, who has closed the chapter? Those who have not suffered from that. But it's not a closed chapter. And secularism did not mean Hindu majoritarianism. It meant equality of religious communities, and that was the original meaning of the term. Yes. And the question today is, are we back to the original meaning of the term? So just to address now the caste question as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
Well, it has much to do with this communal issue. Why was the BJP so eager to launch the Raj Yatra in 1990? Because of Mandal. Because Mandal was dividing the Hindu vote bank, at least the Hindu Rashtra in the making, and something had to be done urgently to cater to the needs of the upper caste. And 1991 was a very interesting election when you had, in fact, an upper caste in Dudhva movement, at least in UP, when for the first time the BJP could make it. So caste dynamics were one of the reasons why Hindutva politics was relaunched. Now the problem is that it is very difficult to so much caste in Indian politics.
Yes.
So 20 years down the road, it may be the half empty glass that they have to assess. Hindutva politics is not enough for get rid of caste politics.
So Hindutva politics not enough to get rid of caste politics. I don't think any of us would actually disagree with that. I will soften. You're going to disagree, I'll come to you. But Mazhar, one of the interesting things that Christoph said is that while researching for his new book, he found that Muslims in many cities referred to this event. It was something that united a narrative, and you have argued in your writing that this was as significant to the Indian Muslim as partition, that it was on that level of a cataclysmic event. More interestingly to me, you also say that if the Babri Masjid had not been demolished, if those domes were still standing today, and many of us were revulsed with by the demolition, but you're actually arguing that if the domes were still intact today, this issue may have remained alive, and the Indian Muslim would have perhaps been more at peril at the receiving end of an aggressive Ayodhya movement. So slightly contradictory there, no?
Life is full of contradictions. I think we have to start with that.
Yeah.
Before I come to your question, I'd like to just point to two arguments which have preceded during this discussion.
Yes.
One is about this secularism being damaged because of this. I disagree with that. I may be in a minority. And the second one is that it was a mass movement, that there is a religious connotation to that. First and foremost, we have to understand that all these things, all the conflicts which take a religious hue or whatever hue, there is always politics behind it. Yeah. So it was totally purely political movement. The second thing which I would disagree with is about this, that it was a mass movement. I don't think it was a mass movement, it was a mob movement. The masses of India were never there behind that movement. The masses of India are not there now. And even if, God forbid, if something happens in the future also, it is going to be a mob again and not the masses of the country. And this is what brings me to understand that the masses of the country, majority of the populations of the country, not just Muslims but Hindus and others, they were revulsed by this whole thing.
No, I agree, but
yeah,
but you feel had the dome remained intact, it would have continued to remain perhaps a rallying point for the mob.
To have gather more and more mobs, maybe, because the politics was being played out in such a manner.
And is it not a failure of the Indian state? I am saying the Indian state right now, because there are many questions, of course, for the BJP, but there are many questions for the Narasimha Rao government at the time. There are many questions for Rajiv Gandhi, who allowed the Shilanyas and opened the locks. But therefore, I use the word Indian state, and I want to ask you: is it not that the demolition represents a failure of the Indian state to protect secularism and to prevent the mob from taking over?
Certainly, I agree with you 100%. It represents the failure of the state. It continues even till today, because justice has not been done even 20 years after the event. That has not come.
What would qualify as justice?
What would qualify as justice is, the criminals who are involved in that should be punished, irrespective of who they are, how high they are. Until and unless justice is done, the state would be failing. But fortunately, I feel it is the masses of the country who have pegged on to secularism.
I want to take this to Swapan. For many people, justice is punishment for those who led the Ayodhya movement to the point that the mob was able to take over. The BJP could argue, we lost control, we thought the sentiment was genuine, the action was not. There are others who think the sentiment was a political creation and it was a destructive political creation. As in the same way that you would say what Rajiv Gandhi did with Shahbano was a destructive political move. When Christoph says today, Hindutva alone is not enough to galvanize sentiments anymore.
Yeah, I don't agree with that? I don't disagree that Hindutva alone, because I've always maintained that there was a particular context to that movement. And I also agree that it was not exclusively a religious movement. But yet, there was a very strong political dimension.
But in 2002,
because the targets were political.
But in 2002, for instance, in the genesis of what happened to the Sabarmati Express, that train was also ferrying car sevaks. Yeah. What was the context for car sevaks to still care about this issue in 2002?
Well, in 2002, they went in because they wanted they wanted to put pressure on the NDA government to facilitate the construction of the temple, which was not possible in that circumstances because of Supreme Court, because you don't have legislation, various other factors. But in other words, that mobilization of Kar Sevaks in 2002 was nothing in scale compared to what had taken place earlier. The mere fact that there was an unfortunate incident in Godhra doesn't distract from the fact that by 2002, the Ayodhya movement, insofar as it represented the yearnings for a temple, a new temple, had waned somewhat. And I would agree with Hussain that once the destruction of what those Kar Sevaks perceived as a symbol of national dishonor had been brought down, and a makeshift, albeit heavily barricaded, Ram temple now exists on that site, what are you going to do? You can wait 100 years for a grand temple to come up.
But it doesn't have the same resonance for anybody anymore. Madhu, you want to add to that before I take to Yogendra? You've also made the argument that just as Swapan talks about how a Hindu sentiment was not an illegitimate phrase to use in discourse, you've argued that in a sense this consolidated a kind of political response by the Indian Muslim. Though in election after election, just as there is no Hindu vote, there is no Muslim vote. There may be some parties that the Muslim doesn't vote for, but everybody else, you know, they choose based on their own reasons.
See, there are three dimensions which have emerged out of this after the demolition.
Yeah.
One is the assertion of the Hindu against this majority of the Hindus against this, which again went in favor of secularism, strengthening secularism in the country. I disagree that, Babri Masjid demolition had damaged secularism. On the other hand, it had strengthened secularism, and a lot of Muslims, not only Muslims, Hindus and every other community has now come out openly, those who used to be silent. That is one. Now secondly, when it comes to the consolidation of the Muslim, you see, this consolidation there are still divisions, there are still sect and sectarian other divisions. This consolidation has taken place on two dimensions. One is the development plane, where a lot of Muslims from different backgrounds, especially the rich and the others, have started taking a number of initiatives for the development of the Muslim community, which has really done wonders for the community.
So there was an elite response which wasn't there earlier.
And then the second point is, again, I would not totally agree with you when you say that there is no Hindu vote, there is no Muslim vote. Unfortunately, in our country, thanks to our politicians, still our voting is on the basis of identities, not on the basis of development.
Well, I guess my question, maybe I should have phrased it better, that there are other factors that stratify those identities. I mean, that's actually what I meant.
And then here I would like to just add
quickly,
one.
Because I know.
One thing which I would like to add is, until and unless we can take our politics beyond politics of identity to politics of ideology, all this type of nonsense in the name of religion, in the name of caste,
will go on. But let me take this to Yogendra, and then I'll come back to you, Swapan. I know you wanted to make a point. Yogendra, you made the argument that it is actually the contingencies of Indian politics, the new structures, the new emerging identities, in some ways the stratification and the fragmentation of how politics is constructed now in this country, that actually saved secularism, that created a bulwark against extremism. But that could change. Tomorrow you could have another cataclysmic event. Tomorrow you could have a leader, for example, a politician who's pan-India, who galvanizes people for whatever reasons. So these little fortresses that have been provided by regionalism, by federalism, by caste identities may not exist in the future. The question for India then becomes, could an Ayodhya type movement emerge again?
Barkha, yes, in principle things can change, but a lot has changed in Indian politics in the last 20 years. Emergency showed how fragile Indian democracy was, but its consequences ended up strengthening the idea of democracy in India. Similarly, Babri Masjid demonstrated how fragile Indian secularism could be at a crucial moment. But in the long run, its consequences have been such that they have strengthened the fabric of Indian secularism. I don't think it's so easy now to go back and recreate in 1992, and not just because, as they say in Hindi, "Kaat ki handi ek baar se zyada aap nahi chadha sakte." Not just that you, but apart from that, I think the important thing is that both the idea of a single cleavage, Hindu versus Muslim, did not work. Not only did the Hindus got divided along caste and religious lines, but we must underline the fact, and thereby I just wish to supplement what Mazhar said, that Muslim vote also fragmented. Muslim vote is no longer the monolithic vote which it was imagined to be. It fragmented along political lines. Look at what's happening to Muslim politics in Assam, in West Bengal, in Bihar and UP. Just take 4 examples. This is very, very different. Muslim politics also fragmented on the lines of forward and backward. We have a very strong Pasmanda backward movement among Muslims in Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. So I think it's that fragmentation of political fragmentation which actually saved the day, which actually creates a very different kind of a turf. And no matter who comes tomorrow, they have to play on this turf. And this turf makes it somewhat better for the Indian state. And better for Indian secularism. Let's also remember that while there has been ghettoization, no doubt, while lots of Muslim youth suffer even today in jails and are being dubbed as terrorists, that's a very big hurt for the community. At the same time, this is for the first time that something like such a report comes, that it becomes all right and normal to discuss about Muslims, their difficulties and all the disadvantages. I think we've moved on.
So that's interesting. You're saying that 1992 could not actually take place in 2012, and many of us are agreeing to that point. But Christoph, the remaining questions, that a Mazhar raises, that other people raise, the case is probably going to now drag on in the judiciary for many years. As Swapan said, maybe for the next 100 years. So will there be closure, or will there be that similar sense of fatigue that sets in into most Indian outbursts of anger, where eventually, if you give it enough time, it just passes with the dregs of history?
Well, before responding to that, I'd like to return to the idea that the fragmentation of Indian politics makes another Babri Masjid demolition or Ayodhya movement difficult. Well, it's not so sure, since the whole thing is political. Since the Ayodhya movement was a response to social fragmentation along caste lines in the wake of the Mandal affair, you may still have politicians who may believe that the only way to fight fragmentation is to use political Hinduism as the cementing force. And you can also find probably leaders on the BJP side who may find some significant echo in the middle class of India throughout the country, and the middle class of the south as well as the north as well as the west for sure, and possibly the east, may well find in one man a kind of savior from this fragmentation, from divisions, and you have certainly any idea of the name I would put behind this kind of
well, you're in a city.
So
you're in a city right now, right?
Reaction to
you're in Ahmedabad right now, so you obviously mean Mr.
I'm
Modi.
in the right place. I'm in the right place.
Okay.
Nope. Exactly.
Okay, stop
so
it.
that's a very important, I would say, assessment we must do. And the political dimension of the whole thing, since it is primarily a political
why wouldn't
device,
it happen again?
Of course it can happen
again.
When
political Hinduism, looking for that one person.
The question of the
got your point, Christoph. Just getting Swapan to respond to it.
I just find it astonishing.
Yeah.
That
can I respond to your other
Indian
question on the judiciary?
secularism can be upheld if India fragments. That the idea of a national resolve is inherently anti-secular. That idea to me seems absolutely
I don't think that's what we're being said.
I think that is the implication of what is being said. That the moment you try and unite India, if you say 10 crore Gujaratis,
but you unite India,
that is inherently anti-secular.
But should you unite India? Should you unite India using political Hinduism? That's what Christoph said.
I am not saying that. I am saying that if India happens to be a country
there are different ways
where there is a
80,
78, 80% Hindus,
it
is inevitable that you will also unite the Hindus.
Okay, Christoph, you want to respond to that in just one line, and then I'll give the last word to Mandir. I'm out of time. Christoph, the argument being made here is what's wrong? What's wrong with galvanizing along identity?
No, I'm not saying identity. I'm saying if you are going to bolster Indian nationalism, and you say that Indian nationalism, because it is inherently at 78 to 80% Hindu, is going to be majoritarianism, and secularism is going to be jeopardized by this, and only upheld by fragmentation.
Indian nationalism.
Okay,
you are talking about Hindu nationalism, which is not Indian nationalism.
You see,
you are talking about.
No, 1 second. I think that's an important point. Hindu nationalism is not Indian nationalism.
Of course,
and you are conflating.
No, I am not conflating. You are saying that anything that unites, because the India's demographics.
Okay, I must allow Yogendra to stop, and Mandir, I will give you the last word on the show. Quick responses, very little time. Yogendra ji, pehle aap, and then Christoph. Yogendra.
It's a very interesting and very sad usage of the word uniting the country. Throughout the 20th century, unity always meant Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Isai. Unity always meant bringing everyone together. I think it's very ironic, sad that on this day, we want to use the word unity of India to mean exclusion of a very large sections of India.
Okay,
I think the very idea of India requires that we bring all of them together.
Okay, Christoph, very briefly. Christoph.
Very briefly, I think you mentioned the role of the judiciary in the whole thing. And I think it's one of the keys. When the chapter will be closed after at least one kind of justice, you know, no country experiencing what India has experienced that has not gone through a commission for justice and reconciliation could really close the chapter.
All right,
and that's
two
long
quick
overdue.
points. Yeah. One is I would like to see India united as a unity, as a nation, but not around identities, but around ideology, where everybody.
What is the ideology is divisive?
No,
that is
where everybody
where the spotlight is debated.
Where everybody is a citizen, where we are working for the development of all. It's only then that India can be divided. If we
united, you mean?
United. It's only then India can be united. Otherwise, if we go for identity politics, which we are going now, we'll certainly end up with a divided India, balkanized India.
Absolutely.
One. The second thing is, you had also asked about whether, Babri Masjid can be repeated again. And it was said that maybe it can be repeated again. I disagree with that. Babri Masjid at the national level perhaps can never be repeated again, which is fortunate. But unfortunately, I am afraid that many Babri Masjids will be repeated in different parts of the country, because some people, at least the mobs, realize that you can do anything and get away with it in the name of, getting hurt or sentiments and all that. And the Babri Masjids of the future will be all over the country, not just against Hindus, Muslims, but it could be so many other things.
So how we construct our identity politics is key to how we define the future of India, in a sense, because identity isn't going to go away.
Identity we have to take it away. Identity has to be
not going to go away, sir.
Identity has
not going to go away, certainly, but it is not necessary when you're talking about the unity of India to actually spell out it means Hindus, it means Muslims.
Why not?
Why not? Because it's not imperative. It is not imperative. Because you're bringing out those fault lines at the same time.
Diversity,
no, it is diversity, but we have this diversity. It's given. Let's talk about the unity
socially, but what I would like to say is,
yes.
No.
Go ahead. I don't.
Fine. When you fold your hands.
No, I want to fold my hands.
Fine.
No, go ahead.
So what I would like to say is identity. Identity should be that of citizens, of being equals. And when we can create that identity, one thing I would like to say very categorically, if we fail to create that identity in the next 50 years, we will not be there.
So we end with that. We do
not want fragmented nationality. We want equal citizenship.
We will
Thank you very much.
Okay, they're shaking hands and agreeing on something in a debate that continues to remain an emotional one 20 years later. I think there's a lesson to be drawn actually from that. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time. Mazhar Hussain, Swapan Das Gupta, Yogendra Yadav, Christophe Jaffalo. It does raise all sorts of questions for the very idea of India, questions we haven't agreed on, but at some point a national consensus will have to emerge, because it isn't enough to be just a democracy. It is our diversity that must be preserved by the civil rights of that democracy. We'll take a quick break. On the other side, William Dalrymple joining us on Afghanistan and his new book. You're watching The Buck Stops here, and we're now turning our focus away from politics to look at something that has the international community in a quandary: Afghanistan. As President Obama continues to argue that troops will have to move out of Afghanistan, most people who know the region must wonder what was the point of it all. Tonight, we introduce you to our newsmaker, William Dalrymple, who's just out with his new book on Afghanistan. It's called Return of a King. It's right here in front of me, a big fat tome that William spent many years and a long time working on, and very interestingly makes the argument that history is ominously repeating itself in Afghanistan and may have even turned full circle. Thanks very much, William, for being on our program on the night that your book launched in Delhi. Now, you've of course chronicled the story of the First Anglo-Afghan War, and just reading about it and reading through your book, it's actually a pretty eerie sense of deja vu. When did you pick up on this sense that this was an example of history repeating itself? How did you stumble upon this narrative?
I started on this because the parallels were beginning to seem a little eerie.
Yeah.
In about 2006, 2007, when the thing began to get difficult. If you remember, I mean, it's impossible to remember now, but in 2001, when America and NATO went in, it was an incredibly easy conquest. There was very little resistance. The Allies were welcome. The Taliban were hated. And there were those sort of stupid statements saying that not a shot will be fired. It'll be a kind of Switzerland-style operation. Then about 2004, resistance began. By 2006, there were serious casualties. By 2007, NATO found itself surrounded in a few urban centres, and the countryside was overwhelmingly in the south of the country going to the Taliban. And anyone that knew Afghan history, and I've always been very interested in the history of Afghanistan, could see that this was a very eerie reworking of exactly what happened in the mid-19th century in the first Afghan war. But it was only when I actually got there and started really researching this that the parallels moved from sort of interesting to almost eerie.
Because you actually quote a reverend at that time who writes shortly after his return about how this was based on doctored intelligence, and this reverend then says not one benefit,
the invasion,
not one benefit, military or political, was acquired with the war. It was waged on doctored intelligence. So now this could be the story of...
We have a dodgy dossier. It's a mixture, it's an odd mixture of the Iraq war and the Afghan war.
Yeah.
There is one stray sighting of the Russians
weapons of mass destruction is the Iraq story.
So you have a bit of the Iraq story. In this case, the Russians are supposed to be meddling in Afghanistan. In fact, they're about 1,000 miles away. It's complete nonsense, but it's an echo chamber of hawks reflecting each other's prejudices. And by 1839, the British have led themselves to believe there is an imminent threat to their Indian empire, and unless they go into Afghanistan, leapfrogging Ranjit Singh's empire, leapfrogging Sindh, they do this sort of absurd journey through thousands of miles of desert to take Afghanistan from behind. But the real parallels are more extraordinary still. I didn't know until I went there, and I don't think this has ever been said, that Shah Shuja, the king that we...
is from the same tribe as Hamid Karzai.
The tiny sub-tribe, the Popalzai, as Hamid Karzai, and the guys who brought him down, the Gilzai, are now the foot soldiers of the Taliban. It's the same war being refought in the very same cities.
And in a sense, is it the same questions being asked about who Shah Shuja really represented? He represent all of Afghanistan. The same thing today said disparagingly about Karzai, that he's the mayor of Kabul. So what do you think explains it? Is it that you think that the world has never really understood Afghanistan? Is it the terrain of Afghanistan? Is it its particular history? Is it that the homogenizing effects of globalization have not and may never permeate into in Afghanistan?
I think the geography of Afghanistan means it's a very diffuse country. It's a very difficult country to control, partly for economic reasons. If you invade Iraq, you can exploit the oil, you can extract the oil and pay for your occupation. If you invade the Punjab, there's lots of rich farmers you can tax. But if you invade Afghanistan, it's going to be extremely expensive to put garrisons in each remote valley, and there's no one you can tax in order to, and nothing you can extract in order to pay for it. Therefore, the occupation of this lovely bit of real estate in the middle of Asia, which leads on one side to Iran and another side to China, to Central Asia, to India and Pakistan. Every empire that wants to control this area needs to feel that it has Afghanistan. And yet the reality is when you get there, it's extremely expensive to control, and there's nothing paying for the occupation.
But here's the problem. Today the Taliban has become a byword for a certain kind of militant orthodoxy. So when you have, for example, Pakistani politicians like Imran Khan, who once used to say that, you know, you should look for a political solution, he was dubbed Taliban Khan. Today he turns around and says that, you know, all of you called me a radical, but even the Americans are talking to the Taliban. But in India, the position is still, there is no good Taliban, bad Taliban, we won't talk to the Taliban. How do you make sense of this dichotomy where there is a certain moral judgment of the Taliban?
Well, I think there's good reasons to take moral judgments of the Taliban in what they've done and what they did to women and so on. It is by any standards, you know, take any Islamic country anywhere in the world, the Taliban was the furthest extreme of not just orthodoxy but extreme Puritanism. It was a revolting extension of all the most puritanical principles you see even in places like Saudi. I think for India, if we're talking about the current situation, it's a very interesting situation because actually how many serious interests do India have in Afghanistan? Not that many. The real attraction of Afghanistan for India is that the Pakistanis really want it and are terrified of what you guys are doing. And I mean, I'm not Indian, it's not for me to answer for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but I would have thought that here is an ideal opportunity to say, here is something we can trade off with the Pakistanis. We can agree not to get too badly involved in Afghanistan in return for something we do need badly and mind very much about, which is Kashmir. Some sort of deal can be done. India can agree not to occupy the back door, which will terrify the Pakistanis, which sets the entire Pakistani military a jitter with fear, in return for some sort of deal of keeping them out of Pakistan. I think this is a bargaining chip that India, if it's clever, can use very much to its advantage.
But will the exit of foreign troops from Afghanistan actually lead to the end of the great game, playing, you know, in this battlefield for strategic depth?
As if. No, I mean, this is
this
is something that's been going on forever.
Yeah.
Afghanistan remains this area which is lacking coherence, lacking a strong internal coherence. Therefore, it's very attractive for its neighbours, and obviously the next big neighbour who's coming up is China.
Yeah.
The book ends with the prediction by one of the elders in the village that I'm sitting in that China will be the next power to occupy. The reality is China, much more cleverly than either India or Britain or America, has simply bought up the mineral rights, these rare earths, these extraordinary mineral resources which do lie there. And at this very moment, they're building a railway line through the Wakhan corridor from Kashgar in order to extract it. So China may potentially be the one imperial power which will actually crack this one. In other words, just exploit the mineral resources, get what they can out of the country, but not put in troops on the ground and not outrage Afghan opinion by being a foreign presence. What is much more likely, if history repeats itself as it always has, is that the Chinese will feel the need to defend their investments, and sooner or later they'll be drawn into the country with the same tragic results that we've seen 4 times in the case of Britain, once in the case of America, and potentially for India a lure to be avoided, I would have thought.
Finally, you call this book, The Return of a King, a parable of disaster.
That's not the subtitle. That's your spin.
No. But
Yeah.
you know, it is a parable of a disaster. You've spoken about how this Afghan war was perhaps the most humiliating for any military anywhere in the world.
We haven't said the simple fact of the war, which is the great bit of the story, which is what drew me in. 18,000
troops
East India Company troops, Biharis, Eastern UP, Brahmins, Rajputs, East India Company.
And how many make it out?
One man.
That is extraordinary.
People, as recently as the 1950s, the incoming Prime Minister of Britain, Alec Douglas-Home, went to see his predecessor, Sir Harold Macmillan, and said, any advice for me? And apparently he was advised, by dear boy, as long as you don't invade Afghanistan, you'll be fine. So
Afghanistan is not to be messed with. Don't touch it. Leave it alone.
Touch it. Leave it alone.
If the story of today's Afghan wars had to be written, would history look back at it and call it as much of a disaster as this war was for the British?
Well, so far, this war has followed exactly the trajectory of the 1839-42 war. Whether America and Britain will end up withdrawing in such a disastrous fashion remains to be seen, but the lesson has to be drawn that you just don't go in there, that you don't go meddling in other people's countries. Leave it alone. It's more trouble than it's worth.
Are you sending a copy of your book to George Bush?
I haven't as yet, but it has. A copy has gone to Karzai's security chief, Amrullah Saleh.
and did Karzai appreciate being compared to Shah Shuja?
We'll see that.
Well, it sounds like a fascinating read. Many contemporary lessons to be learnt from a slice of history. Thanks very much, and congratulations, William, on the launch of The Return of a King. Well, that brings us to the close of the Buck Stops here tonight. We'll see you now on Monday night at 10 p.m. from the entire team. Have a great evening. Thanks for watching.